and 1860 were both census years as well.
Okay.
If I could pick to restart the museum, we would go on a census year instead of smack dab in between two of them. So
Right.
we have, in the 1850 census, we have what's called the slave schedule.
Uh-huh.
Happens again in 1860. And what that does is that goes through and takes a census of enslaved people here across the United States. This family, I believe it's 7 enslaved people that are held in bondage here in 1850. I know it's 10 in 1860. And I think that there are 2 slave homes. So homes for those families, whether they were families or not, but people to live
On
separate
site?
from
Is
them
it on site here?
enslavers. All of these homes were actually relocated to this site.
Okay,
The
okay.
only structure that's original, there's a little stone cellar down at the end of the lane. But everything else is original to the time period.
Right.
But it was just moved
Moved
here.
here.
And reconstructed. So this actually, when we acquired the property, this was part of a larger home. This was the L off of the back of a 2-story home.
Okay.
And they knew that this was the oldest part of the home, that the 2-story section was younger.
Right.
But I believe that it probably would have been there in 1855 because, as I said, this family owned 10 slaves. And
Right. They
gives you
needed the
some-
space.
For this area, for that time, that was a pretty good size.
Now, when they owned the slaves, what type of work did the slaves do?
It really depends
Okay.
on what their enslaver does.
Right.
Most of these men were farmers.
Farmers,
And,
okay.
and so they were directing their slaves to do field work, but much different than our further south
Right.
plantations.
No cotton.
No cotton here. We're growing a lot of hemp, which gets turned into twine.
Right.
So we are still very connected to the deep south because that twine then goes south to wrap bales.
Right.
That enslaved people further south are.
Okay, so you said Missouri farmers probably, what was their primary crop that they?
Indian corn.
Indian corn.
Or what we would call field corn.
Field
today.
corn, okay.
Hemp, and then vegetables.
And
It
vegetables.
really depends on the family. I mean, some folks, mules are
Yes.
being raised in this area, so some folks are going to be working with livestock.
Okay.
more. We have an ox drover on site that actually works with our oxen and our mules, and so she kind of can help represent that a little more.
Sure.
She's not in today.
Sure.
Have her hitch up the team for you.
Okay, now I heard you, not a different subject, I heard you were making biscuits.
I am going to be making biscuits. So,
Okay.
unfortunately, it's going to be a while before I actually get to the biscuits.
No worries, we could come back and
because,
visit.
If you see my fire,
Yes.
on the right hand side there is what we would in a modern kitchen call a Dutch oven.
Mm-hmm.
I would just call that an oven in
Okay.
1855.
Right.
And so what I have to do is build up enough coals that I can pack those coals on about a third on the bottom, 2/3 on the top of that oven,
Uh-huh.
with my biscuits on the interior.
Wow.
So, historically, we would have had fire going 24/7.
24/7,
Even
right.
on those lovely 110-degree days that we
Really?
had this summer.
Wow.
Because you needed hot water for everything. You needed
Exactly.
to make your coffee in the morning,
Right.
to wash your dishes, to
Right.
wash your kids' grubby faces,
Right.
all those things. Take a bath.
Yeah.
So we would have always had, even if it was just banked coals, you would have always had something going.
Okay.
So it made it a lot easier to then turn around and make biscuits. For me, I started my fire fresh at 9 with no coals.
Right.
So it'll take me a while to build up enough. I'll probably got another hour.
So you scrape up all the coals over here and then you surround that?
So if you see on the brick on the hearth,
Yes.
what I'll do is I'll take probably 3 shovels full of coals,
Uh-huh.
put those kind of spread out in a circle on the hearth,
Okay.
put the Dutch oven smack dab on top of those.
Mm-hmm.
There'll be a little trivet, which is just a little piece of iron that's sitting on top.
Right.
Made
I see
into a
that.
circle that I'll put inside of the Dutch oven.
Mhm.
Put a ceramic dish with my biscuits on top of the trivet. Put the lid on, and then put the coals on the top.
Wow. Well, so I know a lot of my viewers are going to ask this question, and I want to ask this question too. What was life like for a woman in 1855?
Depends on the woman.
Really?
It absolutely does. An enslaved woman's life is going to be very different than a woman who looked like me.
Right.
Right?
Right.
And that's something I always try to talk about because we
Do you?
don't really do a great job of representing enslaved lives on the site. You wouldn't have seen me doing this work.
Right.
I would have been directing the enslaved women that my husband owned.
Right.
And, you
To
know,
do
it
the
made her-
biscuits and did everything.
Exactly.
I got you.
And even there was a historian that just did a study of WPA slave narratives.
Okay.
Which are from the later part of the 19th century or part of the 20th century. And she estimates that as many as 1 in 5 white women
Uh-huh.
used black women or enslaved women as wet nurses.
Wow.
So I would not even have nursed my own children.
Children. Wow.
Which is a difficult concept for us in a modern sense, but
Yes.
it really did depend on your economic status, your race, your location.
Uh-huh.
My story is going to be really different than a
Yes.
lot of other women.
Exactly. And so would you say that, like from economic standpoint that is based upon your stature, how many slaves you had, how much field production,
Yes.
and all those different things
Absolutely.
determine
So,
what a
like, the
woman would do.
that
Okay.
lives down in what we call our settlers cabin, the Luttrell family.
Uh-huh.
Her life is going to be very different than the wife of Martin Slaughter, who's the man who owns our colonel's house.
Okay.
That family in 1860 owns 50 slaves.
Uh-huh.
The Luttrell family owns 3.
Wow.
So she's going to be doing a lot more work.
Right.
Especially because the 3 enslaved people that are there are all children.
Oh, wow.
Which is also hard to
Yeah,
figure out
hard to
and talk
imagine.
about.
So
Right.
they bought the children at a lower price, would you think, or
Possibly.
possibly?
Unfortunately, we don't know their stories.
Story,
We
right?
do know there was one girl named Julia. We do actually know her name,
Uh-huh.
but we don't know much beyond that.
Right, because the slaves never had their last name; they adopted the
It's
slave
very
name of the
common
owners.
after the war for formerly enslaved people
Right,
to take the names of their former enslavers.
right,
Which, from a genealogy perspective, a historian's perspective, makes things easier,
right.
but it's also kind of horrible.
It
to
is
think about.
right because right,
Yeah,
exactly.
There's a woman who comes to live in the building we know as the tavern today.
Mm-hmm.
Her name is Matilda Funk, Funk, and then it's Chevis, and then it's Samuels.
Mm-hmm.
She changes the name. She's actually born either newborn enslaved and newborn free, because she's born in either 64 or 65. So she's born right at the end of the war. But her
Right.
mother is enslaved to a man named Funk, who's the neighbor of the tavern.
Right,
And then she comes to work at the tavern and
Mm-hmm.
lives with the family, probably in one of the former slave homes,
Mm-hmm.
and changes her name in the census to Chevis, which is the name of the owner of the
owner,
tavern.
right,
And then as she gets older, the son-in-law, Samuels, takes over, and her name becomes Samuels.
right. And one of the things that I'm glad I'm here. I've been here several times, and I
Yeah.
appreciate the candor and the honesty of the historical background. Because in 1855, a man like me could most likely be enslaved unless I either bought my own freedom but particularly in Missouri, I would be indentured to somebody, or otherwise I'd be hunted as an outlaw. And so I think it's interesting in doing agriculture that all kids in the modern, today, 2020, understand the historical context and understand where things were. And it's not necessarily to say anything negative about the past, but we must understand what things were like so we can maybe perhaps do things differently in 2020.
People in 1855, I mean, the context I try to put it in today, in 2020, it's where do you stand on Black Lives Matter?
Right. Exactly.
Are you active? Are you out in the streets? Are you protesting? Are
Right.
you mad that people are damaging property? Because there were people that were mad that fields were being burned by enslaved people
Right.
in this time period too.
Wow. See.
And so the stance that you take today is probably pretty similar to what you would have taken at the beginning of the Civil War.
Right.
Which is really where we are.
Yes,
Right.
and isn't that interesting? Based upon your social status and your raising and upbringing, maybe dictates how you perceive things like this. And
Very, very, and we talk a lot about our age. Probably did that too. I mean,
Yes.
just like in the modern sense, you get a little more conservative generally as you
Right.
get older. It's one of my staffers. She and I talk about this a lot. It's like, what would we have done?
Right.
In 1955? Would we have kind of gone with the status quo?
Right.
Would we have been very anti or pro one way or the other?
Right.
Like I grew up in Iowa. I moved to upstate New York. I lived abroad for a while.
Right.
Those opportunities I would not have
Had.
in 1855. So
Right.
it's probably likely that I would have been like, no, my husband depends on enslaved labor.
Exactly.
I need my little maid to make my hair look good.
Right,
In the mornings. Like I
right.
care about her.
It's part of your economy and survival, your sustainability.
Absolutely.
And so, yeah,
Yeah.
now that's a very interesting perspective on it because, and that's kind of, even doing this assignment, I want to do it in the context of 2020
Yes.
and show what was going on back then. And it would just be unfair to what's going on now to do a museum and just take pictures and not speak about the same events that were going on back in the Civil
Well,
War.
In 2020, if you look out in California right now,
Mm-hmm.
there are immigrants that are in the fields in the most hazardous air we have ever had,
Right,
harvesting crops.
exactly.
So this system has not really changed.
No.
Or prison labor. It's really
Yes.
this.
It's right, and
We've
it's
shifted some things around. but
Correct.
The structure is still in place.
correct,
in a lot of
and
ways.
and you're right. I believe people have to intentionally look into history with not necessarily his story, but the really what happened.
Yes.
and how it impacted different groups. Like you were saying, your perspectives are totally different based upon where you are and where you live versus the lady that lives down the street with 3 slaves versus this house would represent 10 slaves.
Yes.
And the economic, political influence, all those social economic status, all those things would change if it was threatened by a civil war, by an uprising. Regardless if it's right or wrong, you're kind of like the benefactor of it. If it changes, you're threatened.
Oh yeah, but there, I mean, we have document. Thomas Jefferson talks about how, oh, I'm giving them skilled labor, I'm giving them a roof over their head, food to eat. He was this very paternalistic mindset.
Right.
Which I'm sure people in this area in time were, as we haven't found those diaries in the attic that tell us exactly what
what was
she
going
thinking,
on. But we know history tells a different story, but you have to look at, it's like a coin. The other side is not the same size as the other one.
Yes.
Right.
Yeah.
Wow.
And really, the Civil War has already started. In my professional historian opinion. So in 1854, we have the passage of the Kansas-Nebraska Act.
Right.
Which says that it nullifies the Missouri Compromise. The Missouri Compromise had said that anything north of the southern border of Missouri had to be a free state.
Right.
Anything south had to be
a slave state.
Except for Missouri. That's
right.
the compromise.
Right.
And then we get the Kansas-Nebraska Act, which says that both of those who are north of the border can decide for themselves.
Exactly.
Popular sovereignty.
Right.
So men living in these houses
yes.
in November of 54 and in March of 55 cross over the border to the territory of Kansas and legally vote in elections.
Correct.
To try to make sure that the new legislatures coming in are going to be pro-slavery.
Pro-slavery. And
there's this kind of unwritten agreement
yes.
that if you are on the edge of Indian territory, right, in a settled state, you had first dibs.
Right.
You could go over and settle and do what you wanted.
Right.
And we have what's called the New England Emigrant Aid Society. It's a group of abolitionists from New England who are like, no, we don't want Kansas to be a slave state because it's going to change the balance. I mean, Nebraska was already kind of a done deal. Everybody knew Nebraska was going to be a free state.
Right.
So these people are coming in, and there's talks of like crates that are labeled Bibles actually being full of weapons, and all of this tension is building up, and these people living in these homes are like, they're gonna go ruin my livelihood. They're gonna make it so my enslaved people can escape. Right? Because that's a free state right over the border.
Right over the border, where Quindaro is, where the slave ruins, and then bloody Kansas resulted out of that.
Yeah,
John Brown and Lawrence. Yes. And so, our area has tremendous amount of history. And kind of recovering that, particularly with the 2020 context of things, it's amazing. Like you said, the Civil War started long before the actual declaration of war from the North and the South.
First death is in December of 55 for Bleeding, Kansas, which I believe is the start of the war.
Right.
So.
No. Thank you so much. What is your name again?
I'm Jenna. I'm the site supervisor.
Jenna, okay. I appreciate you. My name is.
Come back and see how my biscuits
I will. We'll check on the biscuits and we'll get a picture of that.
And
Thank
if
you.
Have any questions up at the visitor center, she has a copy of my business card.
Okay.
If you want to take one of those, and anything I can ever do to help you
I will.
Answer any questions.
I want to bring a group of kids out here, Jenna, and talk about it. And because we do urban agriculture and we do aquaponics, so we talk about fish and plants and all those types of things. So
my hometown had a kitty parade every year. And 1 year I went as an aquaponic.
Did you?
See, I had a little wagon with a little tub.
Yeah.
With fake flowers.
Well, the flowers. The goldfish swimming at the bottom.
Really
Exactly.
Yeah,
so,
let us know.
Thank you, Jenna. I appreciate the time. And like I said, this is going to go out to a whole bunch of kids in the communities, particularly kids of color, and that they need to understand the historical significance of agriculture in America and the role of, if you will, their forefathers. Even enslaved, were still responsible for incredible innovations, incredible ingenuity, and contributions.
We've been talking a lot about vanilla
lately,
and the fact that it was and I cannot remember his name, I apologize, but it was an enslaved young man, I think he was only 12.
Oh, wow.
Who figured out how to hand pollinate vanilla in the early 1840s.
Wow.
Before that, you had to just kind of hope that the bees got to it. There's only a single day when the orchid flower is open.
Wow.
And so vanilla used to be a thing only kings could afford.
Wow.
Or the president. It was very upper class.
Right.
And so we used rose water a lot in our recipes. A lot of my recipes from my recipe books talked about rose water as the kind of common ingredient that by the 1850s, 1860s gets supplanted by vanilla because this one young enslaved man figures out the technique.
Wow. See, that's incredible. We need to Google and find out who he is, class. That's an assignment.
I'm sorry. I
Well,
forgot.
no, that's all right, Miss Jenna. We'll find it out. That's part of the things about learning. You just got to go dig for deeper to find out who that is.
Yeah.
But
yes.
thank you so much. I appreciate it.
Absolutely.
Talk to you soon.
Thank
Bye
you.
bye.